Leningrad, December 1990. The cargo ship sits frozen in the harbor, engines running. Inside the hold are 300 tons of frozen beef, but the captain won't unload. He's on the radio with his company in Hamburg, and the message is simple: the check bounced. On the dock, a Soviet official is pleading. He's got authorization letters, signatures, seals. But the Germans don't want paperwork. They want dollars, real dollars, and the Soviet Union is out. This is the moment a superpower learns what it feels like to be broke. Not weakened, not declining, but actually literally bankrupt, unable to pay for meat. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Soviet Union had 40,000 nuclear warheads. It had the largest army on Earth. It had conquered half of Europe and put the first man in space. But in 1991, it couldn't afford to feed its own people. And here's the thing, nobody tells you. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of Ronald Reagan, or because of freedom, or because communism was destined to fail. It collapsed because it ran out of money. The red flag came down on December 25, 1991, not because of a revolution, but because the accountants closed the books. This is the story of the greatest bankruptcy in human history, and it begins not with a manifesto, but with a hole in the ground in Siberia, and a decision that would doom an empire. But here's the number you need to remember: $70 billion. Dollars that the Soviet Union left behind when it died. It took Russia 26 years to pay it off. 26 years of interest, of renegotiation, of humiliation. The final payment was made in 2017 to a country that didn't even exist when the debt was incurred. That number, $70 billion, is the autopsy report of a superpower. And to understand how you rack up that kind of bill, we need to go back to the moment the Soviets thought they had won the economic lottery. The year is 1965. Soviet geologists are drilling in the frozen swamps of western Siberia, and they hit something big. Oil, not a small field, but an ocean of it, the Samotlor field. At the time, it was one of the largest oil discoveries in human history. For the Soviet leadership, this was a gift from the gods of dialectical materialism. Their economy was already sputtering. The factories were inefficient. The collective farms were a disaster. Consumer goods were a joke. But now, they didn't need to fix any of that. They just needed a drill. Throughout the 1970s, the global oil market exploded. OPEC cut supply. The West panicked. Prices went from $3 a barrel to over $30 a barrel, and eventually spiked past $120 in 1980 adjusted terms. The Soviet Union became the largest oil exporter on the planet, and billions of dollars in hard currency poured into Moscow. It was the greatest windfall in Russian history. But that windfall was a poison pill. Because the oil money was so easy, the leadership stopped trying to fix the broken engine under the hood. Why bother reforming the factories when you can just sell more oil? Why fix agriculture when you can import grain with oil money? The Soviet Union became a petro-state, a third world economy with first world missiles. They stopped producing things the world wanted to buy. They were exporting raw crude and importing everything else: food, machinery, even the blue jeans their young people craved. The leadership used the oil windfall to buy silence. They subsidized bread, keeping it cheaper than bottled water. They subsidized housing. They propped up their satellite states in Eastern Europe with cheap energy. They built a military machine that consumed 15 to 20% of GDP. It was a golden age on the surface: stability, predictability. But underneath, the entire system was pegged to one number: the price of a barrel of oil. As long as oil stayed above $30, the game could continue. The second oil stayed below that line, the whole thing would start to unravel. And they knew it. Internal Soviet economic reports from the late 70s warned that the dependency was dangerous. But the Politburo ignored them. The checks were clearing. The people were fed. The tanks were rolling. Why rock the boat? Now, I know what you're thinking. If they had all that oil money, why didn't they just save it? Why didn't they build up reserves or invest in other industries? Because they couldn't. The system was too rigid. Every ruble of oil income was already spoken for before it hit the treasury. It went to subsidies, to the military, to the Eastern Bloc, to propaganda, and increasingly to one very embarrassing line item: grain imports. Let me paint you a picture. The Soviet Union controlled some of the most fertile farmland on the planet. The black soil of Ukraine is legendary. It's the kind of earth that can grow almost anything. And yet, by the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing up to 46 million tons of grain every single year. 46 million tons, that's roughly 20 to 30% of total consumption. They were buying it from the United States, from Canada, from Argentina. They were buying food from their Cold War enemies and paying for it with the proceeds of oil sold to Europe. It was a humiliating cycle. The collective farm system was so broken that half the potatoes would rot in the field before they ever reached a store. Farmers had no incentive to work hard because they were paid the same whether the harvest succeeded or failed. Tractors sat broken for months waiting for parts that were manufactured in a factory on the other side of the country that had no incentive to ship them on time. It was a system designed to produce inefficiency, and the leadership knew it, but they couldn't fix it without dismantling the entire ideology. So instead, they just kept writing checks to American grain companies. By the early 80s, nearly half of the Soviet Union's hard currency earnings were going to buy food. Let that sink in. A superpower spending half its foreign income just to feed its own people. The Soviet Union had become a raw material exporter that couldn't grow its own bread. That's not a superpower. That's a resource colony with nukes. But that was just the warm-up. The real danger is what happens next. Because while the Soviets were riding high on expensive oil, two other players were watching very carefully, the United States and Saudi Arabia. And they realized something crucial. The Soviet bear wasn't invincible. It was a junkie, and its drug was high oil prices. In the early 80s, global oil demand started to fall. The West had become more energy efficient after the shocks of the 70s. Cars were smaller, homes were better insulated. At the same time, new supply was coming online, from the North Sea, from Alaska. The price started to wobble. OPEC was struggling to hold the line. And then, in September 1985, the Saudis made a decision. They were tired of cutting their own production to prop up prices while other producers cheated, so they opened the taps. They flooded the market. The result was an oil price massacre. In 1980, oil was $35 a barrel. By March 1986, it had crashed to $10 a barrel. Some measures show it falling from $120 in 1980 to $24 by '86 in inflation-adjusted terms. For the Soviet Union, this was an economic heart attack. Imagine losing half your income overnight, but all your bills stay the same. The Soviet budget had been written assuming oil would stay expensive. Suddenly, there was a massive hole in the ledger. Tens of billions of dollars just evaporated. And this happened at the worst possible moment. The Soviet Union was bogged down in Afghanistan, spending billions on a war it couldn't win. It was propping up communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Nicaragua. It was trying to keep pace with Reagan's military buildup and the Star Wars missile defense program. And it still had to buy the grain. Every week, ships full of American wheat were arriving in Soviet ports. And the crews wanted to be paid in dollars, not rubles, because the ruble was worthless outside the USSR. You couldn't use it to buy anything. It was monopoly money. So, the Soviets needed hard currency, and their only source of hard currency was oil. When the oil revenue collapsed, they faced a brutal choice: cut the military and anger the generals, cut food subsidies and anger the people, or borrow. They chose to borrow. Soviet delegations quietly approached banks in Germany, France, and Britain. The banks were happy to lend. After all, this was a superpower. Superpowers don't go bankrupt, right? The Soviets had a perfect credit rating. They had legendary gold reserves, rumored to be thousands of tons. They seemed like the safest bet in the world, so the loans flowed in, billions of dollars. But this wasn't investment capital. This wasn't money being used to build factories or infrastructure that would generate returns later. This was survival money. The Soviets were borrowing just to pay for food, just to keep the shelves from being completely empty, just to keep the people from rioting. It was a credit card death spiral. They were borrowing to eat. And then, in the middle of this crisis, Mikhail Gorbachev made a domestic policy decision that turned a bad situation into a catastrophe. He launched an anti-alcohol campaign. Gorbachev looked at Soviet society and saw that vodka was killing people. Alcoholism was rampant. Life expectancy was falling. Productivity was in the toilet. So, in 1985, he cracked down. He cut vodka production. He closed distilleries. He restricted sales. He even ordered the destruction of vineyards. Morally, it might have been the right move. Economically, it was suicide. Because vodka taxes were one of the largest sources of revenue for the Soviet state, second only to oil. Some estimates put it at 10 to 15% of total budget revenue. By slashing vodka production, Gorbachev blew another massive hole in the budget. And the people didn't stop drinking. They just started making moonshine at home, bathtub vodka, industrial alcohol. People were drinking perfume. The state got zero revenue, and the death rate from poisoning actually went up. Meanwhile, sugar disappeared from the stores because everyone was buying it to brew alcohol at home. So now, on top of everything else, there was a sugar shortage. The revenue loss from vodka, combined with the collapse in oil income, created a fiscal black hole. By 1988, the government was running a deficit so large they couldn't cover it with borrowing alone. So, they did the one thing you should never do. They turned on the printing presses. They started printing rubles to pay workers' wages, to pay pensions, to keep the system limping along. But because there were no goods in the stores to buy, the cash just piled up in people's pockets. This is called a monetary overhang. People had money, but the shelves were empty. You'd walk into a store and see nothing but dust and a clerk staring at you. If you saw a line forming on the street, you'd join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be toilet paper. It might be sausages. It might be light bulbs. You grabbed whatever you could because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract was disintegrating. The Soviet people had tolerated the lack of freedom because the state provided stability. You had a job. You had cheap rent. You had food. It wasn't much, but it was predictable. Now the predictability was gone. The shelves were bare. The money was worthless. And the people started to realize the system was broken beyond repair. Meanwhile, the Western banks were getting nervous. By 1989, the Soviet Union owed nearly $50 billion. By 1990, it was over $60 billion. The bankers noticed something alarming. The Soviets were borrowing new money just to pay the interest on old loans. That's the definition of insolvency. The emperors of the Kremlin had no clothes and, more importantly, no cash. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the world saw it as a political liberation. But to the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade in a closed system. Soviet oil for Czech machinery, Soviet gas for Polish coal. It was all done in rubles and barter. Now those countries wanted to be paid in real money, in dollars. The entire trading system collapsed overnight. Inside the Kremlin, panic set in. The gold reserves were vanishing. In the mid-80s, the Soviets had bragged about having 2,000 tons of gold in the vaults. By 1990, they were secretly flying gold bars to London and Zurich, selling them in a desperate scramble. They sold so much gold so fast that they actually depressed the global gold price. They were getting less value for every bar because they were flooding the market in desperation. And then came the War of Laws. This was the final internal blow. The republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, began withholding tax revenue from the central government in Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, told his tax collectors, "Keep the money here. Don't send it to Gorbachev." The Central Soviet budget evaporated. Gorbachev was still technically the president of a superpower, but he had no income. He commanded the nuclear arsenal, but he couldn't pay the soldiers guarding the silos. In 1990, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union started defaulting on commercial payments. Ships full of frozen meat and butter refused to dock. The captains radioed that they wouldn't unload the cargo until the checks cleared. But the checks were bouncing. The Soviet government, the same government that had defeated Nazi Germany, that had built an empire across 11 time zones, was now begging for mercy from German banks and asking for humanitarian aid. It was a humiliation beyond measure. The Vneshekonombank, the Soviet Bank for Foreign Trade, froze all accounts. Soviet companies that had earned hard currency through exports woke up one morning and found their accounts empty. The state had confiscated everything to pay the national debt. It was theft on an epic scale. Trust was obliterated. The ruble ceased to function as money. The economy switched to barter. Factories paid workers in tires, in crystal glasses, in whatever they produced. Workers would stand on roadsides trying to trade a set of tires for a bag of potatoes. The black market became the only real market. The dollar became the only real currency. Taxi drivers and prostitutes became the new middle class because they had access to foreign cash. Professors and scientists stood in breadlines. The hierarchy of the Soviet world had been inverted by economics. In August 1991, a group of hardline communists launched a coup. They arrested Gorbachev. They parked tanks in Red Square. They wanted to restore order, to turn back the clock. But they forgot one thing. You can't arrest a balance sheet. The coup plotters had no plan to fix the debt. They had no plan to put food in the stores. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Not because the people heroically resisted, though some did, but because the plotters realized they were fighting for control of a sinking ship. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow, he was a ghost. The real power had shifted to Yeltsin and the republics. But the debt remained. The Western creditors, the G7 nations, called an emergency meeting. They were terrified. If the Soviet Union broke apart, who would pay the $70 billion? Would Ukraine pay? Would Kazakhstan pay? They demanded a joint and several liability agreement. Someone had to sign for the debt. In December 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money to pay the November salaries. There was no money for December. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, churning out high-denomination notes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived. On December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk in the Kremlin and signed his resignation. He didn't resign because an army invaded. He didn't resign because of a revolution. He resigned because he had lost the ability to write checks. That night, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin flagpole for the last time. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, but the ghost lingered in the ledger books. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherited the UN Security Council seat. It inherited the nuclear codes, and it inherited 100% of the Soviet debt. Russia agreed to take on all $70 billion. In exchange for claiming all Soviet foreign assets, the embassies, the gold, the foreign accounts. It was called the zero option. And that debt crushed the new Russia. Throughout the 1990s, the fledgling democracy was strangled by interest payments, on loans taken out by dead communists. The shock therapy reforms that followed were brutal. Subsidies were cut overnight. The price of bread skyrocketed by 2,000%. Pensioners who had saved their whole lives watched their savings evaporate in days. The poverty that swept Russia in the 90s wasn't caused by the collapse in 91. It was caused by the addiction to oil in the 70s. The pain of the 90s was withdrawal. Russia defaulted again in 1998, sending shockwaves through global markets. It wasn't until oil prices started climbing again in the 2000s that Russia finally had the revenue to clear the debt. In 2017, 26 years after the Soviet Union died, Russia made its final payment. The debt was closed. An empire that had once ruled half the world had spent a quarter century paying off the bill for its own funeral. So here's the thing they don't teach you in history class. The Cold War wasn't won by a missile. It was won by a commodities trader in London who shorted oil futures. It was won by a German banker who called in a loan. It was won by an American grain ship that refused to unload until the check cleared. The Soviet Union didn't lose because communism was evil or because freedom is inevitable. It lost because it built an empire on a single resource. And when the price of that resource collapsed, the whole thing came down like a house of cards. You can have 40,000 nuclear warheads, but if you can't afford to buy bread, you're not a superpower. You're a failed state with expensive fireworks. The lesson here is simple and brutal. Natural resources are not the same as wealth. Luck is not the same as strength. And if your entire economy depends on one number on a screen in a trading room halfway around the world, you're not in control. You're just waiting for the call. The hammer and sickle didn't fall to missiles or to presidents or to ideology. It fell to a balance sheet. And in the end, the number that mattered most wasn't the throw weight of an ICBM. It was $70 billion, a debt that took 26 years to pay, a debt that buried an empire. That's the number you need to remember, because it's the price tag on the greatest bankruptcy in human history.